Great. Well, welcome everyone to this afternoon's SLT Insights webinar with John Tomsett. We are delighted to welcome John to join AQA this afternoon. I'm sure he really doesn't need any introduction, but very briefly, if you're just going about John's background, he's been a teacher and leader in education for over 30 years and has now more recently had a flourishing career in writing extensively about teaching, learning and leadership, including his recent really successful collaboration with Mary Myatt on the Hut series. So John joins us today to talk all things SEND and focus on what we can all learn from leaders in SEND from his recent conversations with SEND leaders. I'm sure many of you have also got his book looking at SEND leadership and learning from leaders there. So I would love to, without further ado, hand over to John. Just a note that we'll be recording this session until we get to the Q&A, and then we'll turn the recording off in case you do want to unmic or take your camera or turn your camera on to ask questions. We've also enabled the Q&A facility today. So if you do have questions as John presents, pop them in the Q&A, and towards the end of the session, we'll have a look at that Q&A and John will be able to look at answering some of your questions. And in the event we don't get to your question this afternoon, we'll publish a follow-up Q&A document and send it out to all participants, or you might be lucky and be able to catch John at the classroom door towards the end of the session. He's happy to stay on a little bit longer today. So thank you so much for joining us, John, and over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. A real pleasure. And so this afternoon, I'm going to talk about SEND and share the lessons that we glean from speaking to some brilliant subject leaders. I'm going to give you a little bit of history about the Her series. The Her series first began with a conversation that I had back in October 2020 with a head teacher from the Southwest, who rang me and said, "John, I'd love you to come and help me hold my middle leaders to account for the curriculum." And I said, "How on earth can you hold someone to account for something you don't understand yourself?" We got over that kind of bristly start, but I think it was an important moment, and I thought about that for a bit. And then on the 21st of February 2021, I emailed Mary Myatt and I said, "Mary, I've got an idea for a book. John Catt are interested." And the working title is The Middle Leaders Guide to the Curriculum for Senior Leaders, so that when we have a conversation about my subject, they know what the hell they're talking about. It's a really funny conversation, that one, between the middle leader and the senior leader about their subject. I was a senior leader for 30 years, from 1991 to 2021. Probably line managed every subject on the curriculum, and not once did we actually talk about curriculum. We discussed meaningless data and drank really good coffee, but we didn't really talk about what was taught and what was learned. So Mary said, "That sounds like a great idea. Why don't we do the interview? Why don't we find 20 odd subject leaders to talk to? Let's start with Key Stage 3. We only intended in the first instance to look at Key Stage 3. So we interviewed 19 subject leaders and 2 senior leaders in the last 6 months of my career. And then from there, we made the book. We transcribed every conversation, pared it down from 10,000 words to 3,000 words. And the book came out in September. In the July, I was speaking at Eton in an Inner Drive conference, and Philip Accordingly, the CEO of Curie, the research organization, one of the best research organizations in this country, was in the audience. She said, "Oh, this sounds like a great book, her book. How about doing primary versions?" So we did Primary Her and Primary Her 2, about 50 interviews with primary experts. Published that in the spring of 2022, and then last summer we published SEND Her, and I have to say that's been my favorite one so far in terms of what I've learned about stuff. I learned so much, interviewed some brilliant leaders in SEND, and at the moment I'm going to give you you'll be the first audience that gets a taste of what we're finding in the final book in the series. The final book is about alternative provision and the curriculum in alternative provision, and I've got 5 or 6 quotations at the end about stuff we're learning in that arena about the curriculum. So those are the 5 books. You've kind of done them in an amazing amount of time. You've done them in 2.5 years, from start to finish, maybe just about 3, when AP Her comes out on the 24th of May this year. It's been a joy, an absolute joy. And what I want to do is talk you through some of the lessons I've learned from the SEND book. Now, they're called Her. We were laughing with Jennifer about that earlier. And we couldn't run July 21, and Mary said we can't run with that long rambling title of yours, your working title. Let's find a title that's going to be catchy. So one of the things that we taught in that very first book, everybody we spoke to said that developing the curriculum was a never-ending thing. It's an endless thing to do. And Mary, being a classicist, I thought, well, I'm going to look up one Saturday afternoon in July. 3 years ago, I looked up the god of endlessness, and the god of endlessness is the Egyptian god. You can see him top left-hand corner of your screen. He's the god of endlessness, creativity, fertility, and regeneration. So he's a brilliant deity to be the deity for the curriculum, and that's why it's called Her. It's also called Her because there are so many moments of enlightenment when we have our conversations. Kind of lots of moments where you go, oh right, I get that, really. And it's also my response when I go into a year 9 German class, which is a kind of one of my areas of additional need. So that tells you a little bit about the story behind Her and what we were trying to do. And the first one then, and then I want to talk about in the SEND series, is the guy who wrote our foreword, Tom Rees. So Tom's really great bloke. He was head of Ambition's training arm. He's now CEO of a big trust. I think it's the Ormiston Trust up in the northwest. He has a son who has Down syndrome, so it was brilliant for Tom to both be an educationist but also a parent. And he wrote our lovely forward. And this is what he said. He said, SEND Her gives us an insight into a movement that says that additional needs aren't special. They exist in every classroom, in every school, and they are therefore something we all need to be able to engage in confidently in an increasingly expert way. And I think what Tom said there is just the theme that runs through SEND Her is that the word special is really problematic. And we thought, my intro is about, should we use the term SEND? Should we use the term special? Because actually all of us have additional needs in one form or another. If you put me in a music class or a modern language class, I would have some additional needs. I've got used to calling it additional needs rather than SEND. But if we didn't call it SEND, no one would know what it's about, because SEND is now in the lexicon of all educators in this country, in England, and it's worth hanging on to that, because I think we might lose some things if we don't. But you don't use the word special in Wales, you don't use the word special in Scotland. So it is an English thing, it's also a Northern Irish thing. So great start from Tom. And there are 3 themes I want to pick up on. 2 from the SEND book, but 1 also in the end, also from the AP Hurt book. So the first one's ambition. So we interviewed a year 6 child, really interesting. He and his mum, he's not called Harry and she's not called Belle, but we put them anonymously. And Harry was a year 5. When we interviewed him, he was April last year, so he was year 6 in April last year. But at Christmas of year 5, he's autistic and ADHD, got ADHD, and his teacher was at the absolute end of her tether. So she had him at the back of the class with his back to the class, he was facing out the window at the back of the room. She taught 29 and he got on with work on his own all day. And at that point, Mum said, enough's enough. He's so excluded within the school. So she brought him to a different school. We interviewed him in the April, and kind of 90-minute interview. It was fun. There was a dog involved. It was pretty wild. We had a great interview. He went on to get expected progress in his SATs, which is just a delight, despite having to move schools halfway through. And at one point, he was talking about how much he likes hard work and how much he loves science because it's hard and you have to think about it. And Mary just said, tell me a bit more about that, Harry. So this is what he said. I like hard because it's learning, because if it's easy, you're not really learning because you can just do it. When it's hard, you are thinking, so it stays in your head. Wow. I remember Mary saying quite clearly, every teacher needs to hear that, Harry. And it was so fascinating. So often we patronize children with additional needs, or we conflate something I'll come up to a bit later. We conflate additional needs, having additional needs with low attaining. And that's clearly not true. Make stuff challenging, make the curriculum challenging. That's what children really like. So we interviewed then Tanisha Pascoe Matthews, who's quite an extraordinary woman. She's a Senko down in South London in the secondary, and she has 2 sons, and they're both autistic. And Jaden, her eldest, didn't say anything till he was 8 years old, didn't utter a word. And he first started talking when he was bought a speaking train. So that he playing with the train started speaking, and he started having conversation with the train. Amazing. And she's written a brilliant picture book about that experience, and you can find it on Amazon. So Tanisha said this, and this is about ambition. I think the curriculum should be ambitious. All students should be able to access the curriculum. Many SEND students simply collide with the curriculum and the knowledge available. I love that word collide. It just bounces off them. They collide with the curriculum because they're not necessarily learning and retaining. Students don't necessarily have the resources to gain that access. One of the things that's really, if you look at the EEF website and you think about how children learn, metacognition, teaching them how to think metacognitively, is extraordinarily helpful, and especially helpful for children with additional needs. So we really like that quote from Tanisha. I interviewed Barney Anglis. Barney himself is autistic, has autism. He's super bright. Some of these people we interviewed, just awesome in the true sense of the word in terms of their intellectual capacity. And this is what Barney said about how we design the curriculum for SEND. I don't think the logic with which we design curriculum for the general population should be any different when it comes to children with learning disabilities, children with rare syndromes, children with autism and ADHD. He just says, just pitch it up. Just, if you've want a rich, challenging curriculum, then make that rich, challenging curriculum for everybody. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you expect that? Another one who's ambitious is Helen Ralston. Helen, really interesting woman. Helen was a year ago when we interviewed her in April last year. She was head of an autism unit attached to a school in London, attached to a mainstream school. And so she had around, I think it was about a dozen children with autism in this unit, and all secondary. So she was really, really ambitious. This is what she said: people might love dinosaurs, but that's not the national curriculum. They can explore their special interests, but we don't design every lesson around special interests. If you want standardized outcomes at the end of year 11, you need to be following something based on the national curriculum. You see a range of provision. We interviewed 31 people, I think, for this, but every single person talked about being ambitious for the children. And you've got to be really clear about what that means. In Helen's situation, in an autism unit attached to a mainstream secondary, there's no reason why those children can't go on and get really good grades. In other situations, and I'll illustrate a few of these, it's different. In one of the special schools heads who we spoke to, the ambition for the year for a child in a wheelchair-bound child with huge additional needs, complex additional needs, might be the fact that when they're being pushed in their wheelchair and you stroke the right-hand side of their face, they're going to turn right. When you stroke the left-hand side of the face, you're going to turn left. That might be their learning aim for the whole year. So it's thinking hard about that, but that would be an ambitious aim for them to understand a stroke of the right cheek turns right and a stroke of the left cheek turns left. But enormously interesting. And Helen Ralston is now the head teacher of Langley Girls' School down in Bromley in Kent. We interviewed Cassie Young. Cassie Really interesting. She's in charge of SEND across a big trust across Hastings, primary trust. She had really clear views of stuff, and she made this point: we need to be clear that not all pupils with additional needs are low attaining children. It's so easy, so easy to conflate children with additional needs with low attaining children. That isn't the case at all. And one of the themes that came through all the conversations really that we've had, both with both for SEND her and alternative provision her, is to get rid of the deficit model about these children. Right? Stop focusing on what they cannot do and focus on what they can do. That's a much better way of thinking about children with additional needs. So really like what Cassie had to say, really good chapter, but that point there, conflating those two things is something we all fall into at times. And I look back now on my career, hold my hand up, have to be guilty of doing that at times. But a really important contribution. And then talking about ambition, what I love about doing this stuff now. So as I was talking earlier to Nick and Jennifer, I'm in my 60th year. I'm not quite sure how that's happened, but I was head teacher for 18 years in 2 secondary schools, one in Pickering in North Yorkshire, and then Huntington School, Research School in York for 14 years. And I was the future once. I was quite a young head once, but not anymore. And it's lovely to be passing the baton on to people who are going to do this stuff when I'm inconsequential. And Oliver Harrison is just that type of man. He's the Senko up in Leeds, up at Trinity Academy in Leeds, and he's really ambitious for his children. We believe it's important not to shy away from giving students a challenge, even though there's a chance that there is some failure along the way. However, if you provide challenge for students and they succeed, it's incredibly satisfying and motivating. A theme I'll come back to at the end. No one is motivated by doing easy things. We all know that, don't we? You know, I don't know if anybody still does Wordle, but I still do Wordle most days. And if I get the answer in one or two, it's really disappointing, not very interesting. But if you get it on the last go, as I did today, you go, yes, great. So always like it when Wordle is difficult rather than easy. And the same with anything. If it's too easy, it's not interesting, it's boring. You go back. If you think you go back to what Harry said, it is so true. And then Rachel Rossiter. Rachel Rossiter was a Senko in a middle school. Really interesting woman. I'm going to talk a little bit about her metaphor that she uses for thinking about adaptive teaching. In a little bit, I'll tell you about that metaphor. But Rachel's really interesting, and I made the massive mistake of asking her to talk to us about her SEND department, and this was her response. You asked me about my SEND department. That's a big no-no in my language, actually, because there isn't a department. I had SEND department removed from everything because SEND must be the golden thread through the school. Her job as Senko was to teach everybody else who teaches children to teach every child in front of them, no matter what the additional need. So she had no TAs. Just repeat that again. She had no TAs. She taught everybody else how to teach children with additional needs. And what I love about the book, because I'm not quoting from everybody in the book, but there's a whole variety of different ways of how people set structures up to accommodate children with additional needs. And so we interviewed Amy Durning. Amy Durning is a TA at the Cambridge University Primary School. As you can imagine, the Cambridge University Primary School is a really high-powered school, you know, mostly professors, extraordinary school really. And Amy Durning has 17 TAs, except they don't call them TAs, they call them learning coaches, and they have the same training and the same level of expertise as teachers. And not only is Amy a TA, she is the Director of Inclusion and Community. So she sits on the trust board with all the professors. Extraordinary. So you've got complete polar opposites. You've got 17 learning coaches at Cambridge University primary school, and you've got Rachel Rossiter at her school with no TAs. And both models are working really well. So next, the second phase of the three things I want to talk about really is how the provision is individualized. We didn't interview Dr. Stephen Shaw, but he's very famous. He's autistic, and his famous line is this: if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And just emphasize, it sounds quite flippant, but I think it's such a profound statement, because what you realize is when you talk to people who work in SEN, in the SEND world, is that everybody's different and everybody has quite unique needs, additional needs, and also you also realize how problematic the term SEND is, because you've got SEN, special educational needs, under one heading, and it's kind of like a deficit model, and it's under one set of legislation. And then you've got disability, which is where what can we do to help people access stuff, which is a positive thing, under completely different legislation. So having them under one umbrella for a start doesn't work, and then under each of those two, SEN and disability, you've got completely different needs with every single child, and that quote is really helpful to illustrate that. So we interviewed Chris Williams, and Chris Williams is a head of a special school up in Cumbria, part of the Eden Trust. Really interesting man. So modest and so under the radar that I couldn't find one picture of him. This is the best picture I could get, and it's a blow up. It's a huge blow up of a photo of him teaching in a class in a newspaper. Even on their website, he hasn't got a photo. And what I found so much is that people would be really brave and really honest about work in SEND, and I'd be on the call with Mary and they'd tell their story. I'd be weeping. At the end of it, Mary would say, John, you've got to stop weeping because they're just doing their job. She berated me, and she was right. They're people who just really dedicated to this work and to these children. And this is what Chris says: we start with the core principle of putting the young person at the center of things and then plan from there. That means we have to consider not only what they need to learn, but how they need to learn. And he was the one who was talking about, if you stroke the right side, right cheek turning right, left cheek turning left. Amazing man. And there, not only what they need to learn, but how they need to learn, brings me on to this point. I think we've spent so long, probably since 2017, especially since the winds of change happened with the inspectorate, focusing on content. We focused relentlessly on what we want pupils to learn, but we haven't thought so much about how we teach, adaptive teaching, and we also haven't thought so much about checking for understanding, because it's a dynamic relationship. All those three are under the title of curriculum. Curriculum is all those three, because, for instance, if you read her book, the first her book, and you read the maths one, you've got Chris McGrain from the biggest school in Scotland, 2,200 children at Holyrood School in Glasgow. He talks about how fed up he was with inheriting a year 10 group who had no idea how to manipulate fluently negative numbers. I've been taught negative numbers since year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6, year 7, year 8, year 9. So eventually found out how to teach them negative numbers fluently using the additive inverse model. Right. So if you don't think about how you teach the stuff and just think about what you're teaching, you end up just giving people stuff, just giving it to them, rather than thinking hard about have they learned it and how do I adapt my teaching. And if you're getting to think about what you want to teach and making sure that children of all capacities and aptitudes can make the progress you want them to, you might have to think about what's the need to know or the need to know in your curriculum. So we spoke to Mary, and I interviewed Dylan William a couple of years ago, and Mary asked him, what do you say to people who say there's too much to get through? And Dylan says, well, whatever you're teaching, get your team together and decide what is the need to know, and what would it be neat if they knew but not essential, and then plan from there. And that creates some flex, because you can hold the neat to know, the stuff, the icing on the cake stuff, for the last lesson or two of a series of lessons, and then if people haven't learned, if the students haven't learned the need to know, then you can ditch the need to know and reteach the need to know in the last lesson or two of a sequence of lessons. If they've learned the need to know and everybody's absolutely got what you need them to get, then you can do the icing on the cake at the end. But that's adaptive teaching. You've got to build flex into your curriculum design if you're going to be able to teach adaptively. If you're going to have to, if you're responding to the learning needs as the assessment, remember, go back, as the assessment, as the checking for understanding tells you. If you've taught something, they've not understood it, you need to check for understanding, you need to go back and reteach it. And the trouble is, if you don't build flex in, there's no leeway, there's no flex, there's no chance of just diverting for a lesson or two. And people say, well, by the end of 22nd of March, end of this term, I've got to be at this point, and there's no flex in the curriculum. I've just got to carry on. And what you're doing then is carrying on and leaving people behind, especially children with additional needs, who may not have grasped something as quickly as you might want them to. So adaptive teaching then is about noticing who's finding it hard or easy, and then being bothered to adapt what you're doing to help them. Apologies for the nutshell, but that is adaptive teaching in a nutshell. And a really brilliant metaphor, which I'm still grappling with about it, is in her book from Rachel Rossiter. She said that one of the things she does is talk about, she put out a tweet. And what we find when we're doing these interviews is that people who are really at the top of their game have great metaphors for explaining what they do. So page 219 of the book, Rachel talks about a tweet she put out, a series of tweets, a thread about a metaphor she uses to explain what adaptive teaching is against differentiation. So, she lives in a small town. There's a new superstore in the edge of town. She goes into town on a Saturday, meets someone, and they say, oh, I'd like to find the way to the supermarket. They know where the hospital is. They know where the police station is. They know where the school is. She can easily direct them to the new superstore. Really easy, because she knows what they know before and can send them on their way. Second person she meets is used to live in the town but has been away for 12 years. Some of it's familiar, but lots of it has changed. But he knows where one or two things are, and by asking him a few questions about what he knows, she can then direct him to the superstore. He'll get there in the end, for sure. Third person's never been to the town before. Rachel spends a long time asking him how he got there, which route did he take, does he know anything, walks a little bit away with him, shows him one or two things, points him in the direction, sets him off. Not sure if he's going to get to the superstore, but he's got a good chance of getting there, and with downwind, downhill, with a bit of luck, he'll get there. But she's done lots more of finding out what he knows and where the gaps are in his knowledge to help get him there. And she said that is adaptive teaching as opposed to differentiation. And then someone said, as a reply, in the good old days or the bad old days of differentiation, you'd have said to the third person, tell you what, don't worry about the superstore. There's a corner shop just there. Go there. It's much easier to get to. And so you end up with corner shop kids rather than superstore kids. And I've been thinking about that as a metaphor. And what I don't like necessarily is the binary nature of it. I think there's too much binary stuff in the educational debates at the moment. So one of the things I'd say is that there are some good things about corner shops, especially for children with additional needs, because everything's the same every time you go in, and it's small, and people know you, and it's human, and it's familiar. Superstores, on the other hand, are modern. They're interesting. They've got everything you need. They're well lit. It's illuminating, and it's always you've got a varied choice about what you have. So what you want is a mixture of the two. All the best things about corner shops and all the best things about superstores to create provision for children. I hope I haven't pushed that metaphor too far. So interviewed Simon Knight. This is talking about going back to, we're talking about individualizing stuff. He was really good. He said this: the starting point is the pupils and their unique needs, treating their development priorities individually. So the curriculum needs to have flex in it. There you are, there's Dylan Williams' flex. All this is underpinned by robust assessment evidence that makes it clear that right now this child knows this, and therefore the next thing to teach them is that. Super stuff. Goes back to that triangle: the content, adaptive teaching, checking for understanding. We interviewed Tracy Edwards. Tracy Edwards used to be a Senko. She's now a lecturer in SEND at Leeds Beckett University. It was just a brilliant interview. Another one of those people like Rachel Oster, who are at the top of their game, have great metaphors for describing what they do. This is what she said: I write about topographical teaching as an alternative to specialist teaching. Topography is a metaphor. So a map charts the surface of a landscape, but you're looking at what's hidden beneath the ridges and the contour lines, exploring beneath the surface of the child. I think that's great. You know, what lots of people talked about was that when you've got children who come into a provision, an additional needs provision, SEND provision, one of the things they spend lots of time doing is understanding the child. And you can't, you can't operate on them, do a lobotomy, have a look in their head and see what's going on. You have to spend time doing that. You have to get beneath the ridges and the contour lines, beneath the sharp edges, between those that cliff edge, and find out what's underneath there. And I really love that as a metaphor. And I think some really good examples, especially the example of the child at Amy Durning's school, who is completely dysfunctional and taking time to find out who they are and what makes them tick. Gary Orbin. Into Gary, I think he's an extraordinary man talking about SEND. He's a head teacher of a special school. He's also been the in charge of SEND content at the Education Endowment Foundation. And he talks about this, another great metaphor, the automatic doors metaphor. So we're touching on the evidence for what works for pupils with SEND. Be best described as an automatic doors approach. There are things teachers can do that are useful for all pupils, or being particularly useful for some, like automatic doors in a shop. And he's a great example. You know, I was thinking today, it's been really cold and wet in New York today. And if I was going into town today and I was going to Marks and Spencer's, the automatic doors would open for me and I wouldn't have to take my cold hands out of my warm gloves and out of my pocket. That's really useful for me. The automatic doors are really useful for me there. Extraordinarily useful if I've got 2 bags of shopping. If I'm in a wheelchair, they're essential, but they're good for everybody. So one of the messages that came through is that everything you do for children with additional needs actually helps everybody in the classroom. And that's something to hang on to. It's not necessarily doing extraordinary stuff, but doing really good teaching really well. Great teaching first is what you need, which will probably cater for 95% of the additional needs that children have. So I got to know this woman, Shelley Moore. She is extraordinary. She's a consultant in special needs in British Columbia. By the time I worked out how to get the time difference, we had a great conversation. And she talks about the 5 Ps of inclusion. Now, in British Columbia, they have 100% inclusion. So it's total. You've got no special schools, nothing. Children with some of the most extreme additional needs are in the same classroom as children right next to them, same children, mainstream children in mainstream classes. So they're not sitting there with a TA or 2, sitting there in their wheelchair, you know, all sorts of feeding tubes, etc., in the same room as mainstream. And so she said 5 things. One is presumed competence. There's that anti-deficit model. Second one is they have a place, but make sure they attend. True inclusivity. They have these things called core competency goals, which are really useful, that they've designed to measure competency of children who may not make it into formal qualifications. And then the last thing she said was that, you know, we teach people how to plan for everyone. And I'm like a Jack Russell after a rabbit. I'm like a dog with a bone. I won't let stuff go like that. And I said, that's just words, Shelley. Give me an example of how you plan for everyone. So she gave us this example, and it's really interesting. She said it's equivalent of your year 10, so they're 14 or I think they were 15 years old. And this English teacher said to her, I want to teach memoir, but I've got Josh in the class in the front row. He's 15 years old. He's never spoken. He's never written. He communicates through photographs. How can I teach how to write memoir with Josh in the class? And what I want the children to do is think back to 10 years to when they were 5. And I want them to write about Christmas when they were 5 years old. So Shelley said, well, let's begin with what he can do. What can Josh do? Well, he can see, he can smell, he can taste, he can touch. He can hear. He doesn't speak, he doesn't write. He can do lots of things. And what they came up with, and he said, what you're trying to do is get him to communicate. So what she came up with was, between her and the teacher, they created a sensory pathway through the classroom. And they had Christmas trees, they had carols playing, they had really lovely cinnamon apple tart, they had cooked a turkey, all the smells and sounds and carols playing of Christmas, presents, and everybody walked through it, and everybody was enriched by it. And children go, oh, I remember that, I remember this, I remember that, I remember this. And so they could all write better, and Josh could tell his story using his images. I said, you've convinced me a bit more, right? I'm not completely convinced. If I've got 30 gnarly year 11s in front of me teaching Romeo and Juliet, I'm looking at the first sonnet. I worry about how I do that, but that is really interesting. It takes some imagination, and it also takes you to think about what they can do, what they can't do. And she talks about over there, just very briefly, models of the movement towards total inclusion and teaching to diversity. So you have exclusion, you then have segregation, that's a special school model. You then have kind of a special unit within a mainstream, or you're there in the classroom, but the child is there with their TA, with what's called a Velcro TA, who does all the work for them, and they don't actually do any work. They're not with their peers. Then you get inclusion, and then she's also working towards trying to define what teaching to diversity means. How do you not only include everyone, but then think about how you promote diverse thinking and diverse experiences. So there's Shelley Moore, brilliant woman, amazing woman. And then we interviewed Ben Newmark, and Ben gives us just a slightly different take on things. Ben has written at length about SEND. He has a daughter called Bessie, and this is what he says about his daughter. She has a learning disability. She has Williams syndrome. And this is what Ben said: I wouldn't want Bessie not to have a learning disability. If you change that about her, she would no longer be the same person. She wouldn't be Bessie, because the part of her which has a learning disability is also the part of her which is everything else. I'm going to end, with some thoughts about success, the importance of success, and about having ambition for children, right? So Bart Simpson sitting, if you've ever seen the episode, sitting on the special needs table, and he says to his peers on the table, let me get this straight. We're behind the rest of our class. We're going to catch up with them by going slower than they are. What a great line. So we've interviewed so many people for the AP book. We've got about 6 to go, interviewed about 18 already. We did interview Daniel Moyes, who used to be head of research at Ofsted, but he wrote a book in 2012. And this quote's always resonated with me. He said, the effect of achievement on self-concept is stronger than the effect of self-concept on achievement. Therefore, the best way to improve self-concept is probably to improve pupils' achievement. So self-concept is what you think you can do, your own sense of what you can do. So what limits you have or not have. And he would say, instead what it really means is, instead of saying you're great, you can do anything if you believe in yourself, just get them to be successful. Help them achieve something, teach them really well, and get them a qualification or something that marks their achievement. Then they'll think, oh, I can do that, I can do something else. I used to use the line when I was head of sixth form in Brighton in Hove Park School, a line from Virgil from 19 BC, I think it was. And he said, success nourishes them, they can because they think they can. And you know, all throughout my life, I found that to be a truism. So then we interviewed lots of brilliant people. Eugene Dwyer, he used to play football for Arsenal and Fulham. He has set up 2 alternative provisions, one in Wembley and one in Dagenham. Really interesting bloke, really enthusiastic. And he said this quite simply: we celebrate every little success, even if it's the minutest thing. Success is so important. You know, we all love some success, don't we? But children with additional needs and children in alternative provision really do. Sarah Marion runs a hospital school up in the northwest. Her line is just a lovely line. If young people feel successful, they're ready to learn. Of course they are. And so many of these children haven't been successful. Jerry Robinson, who works down in Haringey, she runs Haringey's alternative provision, huge operation. And Jerry said this: what we needed to do quite rapidly was improve our young people's sense of worth, their confidence in themselves, their ability to see themselves as successful learners. So success breeds success. They've got to be successful. They've got to feel successful the moment they walk into that area and the next phase of their lives. We interviewed John Dabrow. I'm sure some people have come across John Dabrow. He's retired now, but he used to run 8 different alternative provisions under one umbrella in Stratford and East London. He's absolutely set on the importance of maths and English and literacy and numeracy, getting the basics absolutely right. He didn't learn to read and write until he was 15. He tells it's an extraordinary tale. I was crying, Mary was crying, John was crying when he told the tale about how he learned to read. It's just amazing thing. And he said this: you know, he runs a place where they're really good at maths and English, but they're also, because of the context of where he works, where he used to work over in Stratford East London, on the curriculum and taught was triage, what to do if your mate gets stabbed on the way home, right? That's the reality of it. And he said this: the bottom line is, if you come to one of our proofs, you will be successful. Poof. Amazing. Now, quite recently, and I didn't interview him for this book, but it is, I think it's relevant for this book. I interviewed Sir Simon Wesley, who's the government's advisor on mental health in schools. He's the Regius Professor of Psychiatry at King's, the only Regius Professor of Psychiatry in the country, and the only Regius Professor at King's College. He was brilliant, and I'm just in negotiation with him about including his chapter in the book, his conversation in the book. And he was citing a study that found this: for kids who had every single thing going against them, but miraculously had done well in life, it's a longitudinal study. The one thing that differentiated them 40 years later from their unsuccessful peers was that they were good at something at school. So being good at something at school, sport, art, whatever, maths, English, whatever it is, actually gives you a chance of being successful in your life. Coming to the end of this, I just want to ask a quick question. You know, I'm really interested if you want to put in the chat which of these insights most resonated with you and why. It'd be really interesting to get people's feedback. And I'm going to end with this quote, and it's from Claire Keegan. I don't know if anybody's read Small Things Like These. It's a brilliant book. It made the Booker Prize final 6 the year before last. She's the best thing in writing in Ireland at the moment, and the book's extraordinary. And a year ago this very week, I was in south of Dublin in a convent with her all week and 29 other people, listening to her lecture about the short story. And she was talking about Chekhov. And she talked about how important Chekhov is, and what he says about the characters he creates. He says he creates these characters, and Chekhov says, "Don't judge your character, observe them." And then she talked about the fact that the French for observe was to look was regarder, to have regard for someone. So I wrote this in the introduction to the book. The French for looking is regarder, to have regard for what you're looking at. So not only are you observing your pupils, you're also having regard for them. It's about looking at your pupils with proper regard. And I think it's a lovely, nuanced etymological notion that helps us both observe pupils, but also have respect for them. I think it's a lovely place to finish, having regard for the children with additional needs, children with SEND, and making sure we have respect for them and begin with what they can do, not what they can't do. There you go.